and welcome to the 1895 podcast with me, Tom.
And me, Rob.
And we introduce ourselves here, but we're not going to be doing much of the heavy lifting.
We're not in this episode,
are we? We teed it up last time on the podcast, but if you didn't listen to that, in this episode, we're going to be looking at sourcing and synergies. And to do that, we're going to be revisiting some of the conversations from our European CO2 Summit 5 weeks ago now. We're still getting through all of that content, all of that audio.
And yet it still feels like yesterday.
It really does. And yeah, we're going to go back and listen to that panel session which concluded the event on Future Sourcing Pathways and Pragmatism.
Yep, and for everyone listening, watching perhaps, what better time to get into that conversation when CO2 is so firmly in the headlines, or has been in recent weeks, and no doubt still will be as long as we see these different geopolitical effects playing out. So great time to debate the future sourcing and the synergies with that.
Yes, I think that's enough from us. So let's pass over to us from a few weeks ago and our two speakers, Kripa Balachandran of Mission Zero Technologies and Sarah Grimm of Reverion. Two fantastic experts sitting behind me here. First off, we have Kripa Balachandran, who is Head of Product at multi-award-winning DAC scale-up Mission Zero Technologies, leading the delivery of its first 3 DAC pilots globally. She also previously delivered multi-million-pound programs at Jaguar Land Rover and Arrival, taking new and complex hardware products from concept all the way through to mass production. And we also have Sarah Grimm, who has been a business development manager at Reverion since September 2025, primarily responsible for CO2 storage and negative emission solutions. For the past 3 years, she has overseen biogenic CO2 storage projects. Reverion is a reversible fuel cell system provider and recently secured a $41 million deal with Frontier Climate and plans to begin geological CO2 storage in 2027. At Reverion, Sarah is coordinating the entire value chain from capture and transport to storage, as well as the certification process, regulatory compliance, and financing of these projects. Delighted to have both of you here. I've given you both a quick introduction there, but I'll let you introduce yourselves in a bit more depth as well. So, Sarah, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, thanks a lot for introduction. It's great to be here today. Thanks for the invite. Just a little introduction about me. I'm working in BECS projects now for around 3 years, as mentioned, and we are looking at the total value chain. So starting from capture until storage, even that's not the main purpose of what Reverion is doing. So Reverion is building reversible fuel cell systems. Can dive a bit deeper in what that means in a second. Therefore we have different outputs of our fuel cells. We have electricity, we have biomethane, we have CO2 as well as hydrogen, depending on how we run the cell. Handing over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invite to GasWorld. And it's really nice to be able to talk about direct air capture to some healthy skeptics in the room. My name's Kripa, and I joined Mission Zero 2.5 years ago when the company was 18 people, and we hadn't yet had any pilots online. So I lead the product team, which is the entire product development process, looking at the R&D into engineering and then into project delivery, including procurement. And I was leading the team to deliver our first 3 pilot projects, which I can go into a bit more detail in shortly. My passion is really seeing CO2 being used in both a removalist way, but also in the utilization pathway, which is really relevant to this room and this audience.
Great, thank you both for joining us. Should add here that the Q&A is still open, so please do continue to send your questions in, and we'll put those to both of our speakers later on. But just for both of you, what have been your highlights of the event so far over the last 2 days? We're nearly at an end now.
I think I have learned so much about the CO2 merchant market in this group of people. Probably how important cost is. I always knew that, but I think I've really felt it. I've felt the importance of managing volatility as well in this market. As a DAC provider, we're sat somewhat in the periphery of what you're doing, but it's really hammered home the importance of CO2 resilience, and that's something that products like direct air capture can really help fulfill in this market. So it's been lovely to hear about that, as well as things like transport, the importance of analysis as well, things that we're working on really actively, and to see the latest in those areas as well.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree on what we said so far, actually. First of all, it's great talking to so many different people from different point of views on the whole value chain of CCUS. What is really amazing. And I think especially we had this podcast yesterday afternoon, which I really, really enjoyed, because it made quite clear that there is not like one value chain for CCUS. So there are like certain value chain, and it really depends on the location, on the country, and also on if you want to go into CCU or CCS. So quite enjoyed that one so far. And then also, again, Stephen, thanks for making the little introduction beforehand to Reverion. That was quite an intro for us. Didn't expect that to come up. Also I want to kind of get back to what Wiebe said within the discussion this morning about CCTS, he said, or CCTU. I think like transport is quite key here, and it was really interesting listening to that conversation as well.
Great, thanks both of you for that. Rob, that's a bit of a soft landing done, so perhaps we should delve into some deeper talking points now.
Yes, we should. I love some of those highlights. I also love that just, 2 weeks on from International Women's Day, we've had a third of our speakers today have been female, and also both in this panel, so we're very much giving the concluding thoughts of this panel session, at least, to our female representatives. Let's just rewind before we get to that point. Perhaps, Sarah, you could build on what you've just told us in your introduction in terms of what you do, how your technology works, and why that's important to this room. I believe we may also have a visual aid to pull up on screen if we can.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. Maybe if we can put on one slide. I was allowed to have one slide today. I asked for it. That's not the one I was asking for. Maybe I can also tell a bit about analytical things, but I think that's not the one I was searching for. Yeah, that's it. So I asked for this slide because I think it's like not that easy to understand what we're actually doing. And I think a visualization makes it quite easier. So what we do is we have the biogas as an input stream into our bidirectional fuel cell system. And while this fuel cell system is running, we're transferring our electrical chemical transferring biogas into electricity. And this with a skyrocketing electrical efficiency of up to 80%. So we are holding the world record in electrical efficiency of fuel cells with 74.2% right now. Meanwhile, we are capturing the CO2, the whole CO2 of the biogas. So not only the one from the upgrading, also the CO2 we capture from the transversion into electricity. However, that only makes sense while we have too less energy, so to say, in the system based on renewables. So if we see excess energy in the grid on sun and wind, we are changing to the right-hand side. And then we see a different business case because the fuel cell system changes its direction, and then we're running electrolyzer. And therefore, we can produce hydrogen, and at the same time still upgrade the biogas into biomethane. So we have two valuable streams there that we can then use further on. So I leave it like that. One thing I want to say as well. Reason being here today is CO2, and besides like the development of our fuel cell systems, we also, as been in the introduction already, signed an offtake agreement with Frontier. Frontier Climate is a buyers club. There are big companies such as Google, Stripe, Autodesk, JP Morgan standing behind this buyer club, and they are paying offtakes for CDR credits, meaning the CO2 we are capturing, we are planning into bringing that into storage from next year on. Until 2030, we have the deal with Frontier, and in total, we will store 96,000 tons of CO2 within this deal, with a total volume of $41 million.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. I mean, we heard a lot about biogas and biogenic CO2 across this event, so it's great to get a different take on that. And Kripa, perhaps, would you like any further introduction?
Yeah, I would. I'll tell you a bit about Mission Zero's technology. I don't have a slide, so I'll use my words as best as I can. So Mission Zero is a direct air capture technology. We actually was founded in 2020, and a lot of our existence has been off the back of the UK ammonia plant shutting and really facing a lot of challenges with the UK CO2 supply. So it's been a great opportunity for us to show the importance of direct air capture and how it can feed as an alternate CO2 feedstock. We are an electrochemical DAC company. We heard from Good Phenol from Brian Works yesterday, who has a very similar technology, but I'll describe it in brief. So we capture CO2 in essentially water with some extra things in it, some salt, some things you would usually find in your kitchen, all non-carcinogenic, very environmentally friendly, that helps capture the CO2 in a liquid form. That liquid CO2, liquid-rich CO2, then goes into an electrodialysis unit, where it uses pH swing and an electric current to release the CO2 in a gaseous form in over 98% purity, the rest of which is mostly moisture, a little bit of hydrogen, a little bit of oxygen, a little bit of nitrogen in there as well. So really high purity CO2 stream in a gaseous format. Our process only uses electricity and does not require heat and a small amount of water. So we do put our plants, and we intend to put our plants in co-located spaces, so we don't have to rely on transport. We might have to do that in future. Currently, that's not our intention. And what it means is we only need to be on sites where you have access to electricity and water, which are fairly universally available on any major process plant site. The exciting things about the technology we have today is the breadth of use cases and verticals we are using them in today. So we currently have 3 plants in operation, 2 in the UK and 1 in Canada. So one is a SAF plant at the University of Sheffield in the north of the UK, which is an e-fuels site. One is a building materials aggregate site, and the third is a carbon removal site in Canada with Deep Sky, the project developer. And across those 3 verticals, I'll just talk about the building materials a little bit more. So we are already, I wish I'd seen Stephen's talk a bit earlier where I'd brought a pot of rocks with me, because our building materials site is currently using our CO2 to make building aggregates, which is really exciting. And it's the world's first application of direct air capture into building aggregates being shown today. And in North America, in Canada, we were also some of the first CO2 that comes from DAC that's been injected in saline aquifers as well. That happened this summer. So the use of our direct air capture CO2 is really broad and can be utilized in both the utilization pathways and in removals pathways as well, both of which are equally important in coming years. And in the future, we've currently got a 10 kiloton feed study for SAF ongoing, as well as numerous discussions across numerous industries for utilization and removals. And what we're seeing is people want to remove. They want to provide security of supply for their own CO2. That's why people come to DAC if they're on a utilization pathway. Yes, is it more expensive than current commodity CO2? The honest answer is yes, but that cost is coming down over time. And we're really proud to say that at Mission Zero, between our first installation and our third, we have reduced our capex cost by 60%. That's only in 2 years. So if you extrapolate that over the next decade, the opportunities for DAC CO2 as a potential feedstock, even in this market, is significant. But that's not to say it's not expensive. It is now, but it won't always be.
Well, I think Tom wants to talk about those opportunities, don't you?
Yes, because I'm going to pick up on a question from yesterday, and we addressed it partly during our podcast session at the end of the day, but Vida commented that biogenic sources are important for securing more supply of CO2, but what about those DAC sources? What are the biggest opportunities, but also the concerns that you see with direct air capture?
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of concerns on direct air capture. A lot of them have been echoed in this room. And some of them are absolutely correct today. So some of the biggest concerns people tell us about direct air capture is the fact that it could be considered expensive. Isn't it just in the lab? Is it, isn't it going to be bad for the planet if you take too much CO2 out? Which we can address some of those in a second. But I would say some of the positives and the opportunities with direct air capture is there is so much CO2 in the atmosphere that needs to be removed. There is so much CO2 that needs to be used as a feedstock. You know, in 2050, I think the IEA said that we need 6,000 megatons so 6 gigatons of CO2 as a feedstock. There isn't enough biogenic in the world now, and there won't be in 2050 to actually feed that requirement. So something like DAC, yes, it's expensive now, but let's think about in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, where we've brought down the cost, increased the scale, can help actually provide CO2 to that feedstock. So I see DAC as a great opportunity to diversify our sources of CO2 at scale, where biogenic might not be able to. We definitely need biogenic CO2, though, in the short to medium term. And I also see it as a great opportunity to remove historic emissions. I know this isn't a sustainability conference, but that does come into play when it comes to the CO2 market. And DAC and direct ocean capture, DOC, one of the only ways to really tackle historic emissions at scale as well.
And you have referenced it there. I don't think it's any secret that you're in a room full of a lot of skepticism around direct air capture. We saw some of that yesterday.
Yeah.
So I guess what would be your message to those who are critical or are skeptical of direct air capture?
Yeah, I think I would say that's probably a pragmatic take today. You know, if I was in merchant CO2 today, I'd probably be a little bit skeptical of direct air capture. I'm not scared to say that. I think that is healthy skepticism. I think that is healthy debate, and I hope we can continue to have that debate. But some of the skepticism I've heard is, for example, you know, what happens if we take too much CO2 out of the air? Just some numbers for you. So if all the CO2 that's been added into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution adds up to 1,500 gigatons of CO2. Currently, we have about 2 gigatons of removal capacity per year, and that hasn't really changed very much in the last decade. So it would take us 750 years to remove all the CO2 we added into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. So we do need to do something about that. Why does that matter for this group? Well, in time, we will start seeing biogenic sources going to removals, and that will then change the price of CO2 in the commodity market. So, you know, we do need to remove CO2. So that's the first thing. There's a huge amount of CO2 to come out of the atmosphere to tackle historic emissions. And the other thing is with increasing amounts of requirements for e-fuels. I mean, the SAF mandate is so stringent in Europe and even more stringent in the UK. There is a big demand for CO2, and the more we diversify, if the last decade has taught us anything about the CO2 market, is the more we diversify, the more resilient we are. DAC is one of those pathways, and I would say for all of us to keep an open mind. It's early days, but you know, in 10 years' time, I think we'll be having a very different conversation about it.
Hopefully we will be having that conversation up here on stage in 10 years' time.
Yeah, I hope so too.
We've certainly seen some heated conversation through the years, yeah, where that's concerned. Before we move into some audience Q&A, please do send them in. I've seen one great question come through already. Sarah, perhaps we'll just ask you. I mean, you've shown us the technology on screen there. Do you have any skepticism or any concerns where your technologies and concepts are concerned?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say I agree with what Kripa just said. Like, we have such a huge amount of need to create negative emissions, but also we see, and I think this is like what we discussed the last 2 days, is like we have an increase in demand for CO2 all over the world, and we need to meet that. And there are certain technologies that have different advantages. I think one of the advantages we have is that we can produce power and CO2 in the same time, and that's kind of unique in that pace. So we don't need we are not dependent on the power prices, so to say. What is really, really helpful for us, and I think I just said that beforehand, but we can also double the amount of CO2 that we get out of the biogas. However, for sure, there are like certain hurdles that we are facing, and I think those are the hurdles we already discussed also within the last two days, but I'm happy to repeat those. I think one is key is the transport distances and also the storage capacity. So as been mentioned already, there is a lack of storage capacities, especially if you come with truck and rail. And this is also why I really like the part of what Beaufort said this morning, because transport is key, and we need to find transport that is multimodular, and we need to make sure that also smaller emitters can make it into storage. So I think this is one of the key things, and the other thing is regulation. We are totally based on a voluntary carbon market right now, and we see that there is quite some development within the European Union right now. So the CRCF is being the first methodologies under the CRCF have been published now. So we see some quite developments into the right direction, but it's not clear yet how the CRCF will be implemented into the UTS, and especially how it will be accounted for different technologies having different prices for removals. And I think that's really important, because we can't charge bags with the same price than other technologies do, and this is really keen. And also, the development of the storage, we think that there needs to be more support by the states, by the European Union, in order to develop them and to make sure that there's truck and rail unloading, and that this is given by a price that is actually economically feasible also for smaller quantities, especially given that those are often pay-or-take markets, which can be a quite huge bottleneck for smaller companies. We're handling this quite well right now. However, we can assume that if we want to have more negative emissions, and if we want to store CO2 from all different sources in Europe, we really need to take action on that point.
Great.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's move to some of those audience questions now. I'm conscious of time. We've got 3 good ones come through. We'll try and work through these. I'm going to come to you first, Kripa. You mentioned that you learned more about the CO2 market, the merchant CO2 market, and resilience. You also said that a bit of momentum from waning ammonia sources has kind of helped push things along on the DAC side for you. So this question seems quite relevant. How important is merchant CO2 in your respective business models, or perhaps to what extent?
Yes, so today I would say merchant CO2 is becoming quite important in our business, and it mostly comes from companies who want to build security of supply for themselves. And we've been talking to building materials companies, we've been talking to food and beverage companies. I know that's also contentious as to whether that's appropriate for novel methods of CO2. We've been talking a lot to e-fuels companies as well. We've talked to greenhouse gases, microbreweries, a lot of different people, a lot of different verticals within this space. And what all of them seem to want is two different aspects. Is how can they decarbonize their supply chain? Well, if they want to be cost effective right now to do that, a lot of them are going to biogenic. But the secondary way is also about securing stability of supply. Too many of them have been burnt with no CO2 coming down the pipeline, not being able to be transported, or because of a plant that's shut down, or with price spikes. So in the time where the price has spiked in the UK for CO2, DAC suddenly doesn't look that unattractive price-wise. So it's very important, especially in this world where the carbon removal market is still voluntary. And what I foresee will happen is, in time, as the carbon market becomes regulated, all the reports on the ETS are coming out in the UK and Europe as to how DAC is integrated into that this year. I imagine that the carbon removal market will increase in focus, but right now it is the merchant CO2 market is very, very much a part of our business.
Okay, and the question is in plural, so for you as well, Sarah?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe one more thing I want to say here is we are developing the CO2 market besides what we're actually doing. So we are like, in the first instance, we are operator or producer of reversible fuel cell systems, and this business case is actually already quite economically feasible. Now we are looking at the CO2. We are mostly looking into like covering our deal with Frontier at the first glance. However, as I said, transport is key. This is only economical feasible for our plants that are more covered next to storage facilities as well. So there might be also the option to look into CCU at some points, and we are happy to talk about that, even if it's like not the first thing we are doing right now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that, Sarah. This next question here, this is for you, Kripa. What are a few key advantages of DAC as a new supply source versus biogenic? I guess, why choose DAC?
Yeah, the first thing, and I keep mentioning it, sorry if I sound like a broken record, but is you get to own your own supply of DAC if you co-locate it on site. So you own your supply of CO2, you own the operating of your CO2 unit, you're not reliant on another feedstock, which is one of the challenges with biogenic. You're not reliant on transportation either. And if you use gaseous CO2, you're also not paying for the price of liquefying and thus transporting the CO2. So that is definitely a utilization, some benefits utilization-wise that all basically hit to either security of supply or cost, because you're not trying to manage the cost of liquefying and transporting your CO2, as you would be with most biogenic sources. Another advantage would be the fact that, as I said, you can co-locate your supply as well. An interesting use case that is now coming up with the growth of the removals market is also the MRV element. So how can you monitor and accurately verify the amount of CO2 that's been removed, which is far easier to do with an engineered CO2 removal like direct air capture versus biogenic. That's not, like I said, not to say that biogenic doesn't have its place, but as credits become far more commonplace, getting accuracy of how much CO2 is being removed is really important in the modern marketplace, especially where the press will absolutely destroy you if they find that the quality of the credit that's being claimed for is poor or has been miscalculated. It's just harder to calculate how much CO2 has been removed from natural sources. So those are some quick things on what I would say are benefits, but I have to say there is a place for biogenic. It is ready, it is available now. DAC needs a bit of time to get there.
Sounds like a conversation that could definitely continue out there later on. This next question, Sarah, for you regarding your technology, isn't that challenging for the feasibility study and for operation to have secured off-takers for both electricity and gas, as well as the CO2 on top of that?
Well, secured off-takes, that's the question, what do you understand under secure off-takes? I will just repeat to what I understand so far. So the offtake agreement we have with Frontier is only about the CO2. It's not about the electricity and not about the gas. So as I said, the CO2 is like a side product that we are also covering. However, the plant itself doesn't have to run with a CO2 liquefaction or a CO2 capture, because in the usual cases, the Reverion plant will just replace a CHP plant or even like be additional to an upgrading plant. So I'm not sure if that kind of answers the question, because I'm not fully sure if I understand it right. But no, it doesn't really make the thing harder, because like we have the feasibility study that's going for our Reverion plant itself, which looks quite well already. And then, excuse me, we have an additional case, which is the CO2, and there for sure the business case is quite getting narrow. If we, for example, capture the CO2 in the south of Germany and try to store that in Denmark, for example, that isn't working. However, there are a lot of cases where we see that it's really feasible to do this whole value chain. Hope that helps.
Thank you. We'll use this as a final audience question, because I feel like it's perhaps a good summary point for this panel. What's the realistic delivery volume from your technologies in the overall picture of things? For example, what volume or percentage by 2050? I mean, quite a long way out, but perhaps you could sum up for us.
Yeah, this is a tough question because there's what we want to deliver and what is realistic. So I'll try to get to a pragmatic middle ground. I think we want to, as Mission Zero Technologies, we want to be trying to increase our scale by 100 times over the next decade. So we'd be looking at getting into megaton scale by the end of the 2030s, early 2040s. That's to give ourselves time to ensure that we actually have tested our technology at a smaller scale. We give ourselves time to prove our technology. We find off-takers, and there will be government incentives that also come into play in that time frame that enable the scale to happen as well. And we believe, given the funding that we can see in the pipeline, where the SAF mandate is going, where the rest of the utilization is going, especially within Europe, that there will be a demand for that level of CO2 because we simply can't meet it with all the feedstock we've got today. So I'm going to say megaton scale by the end of 2030s, early 2040s for Mission Zero.
Okay. And to you, Sarah?
Yeah, that's a tough question. So first of all, to give like a little overview about the amount of CO2 we can actually capture. So from one of our units, 500 kilowatt, we can capture around 2,000 tons of CO2 a year. So having a multiple of them at one site makes it economically feasible to have a liquefaction there as well. And we are having big plans, and I'm not saying this is true in 2050, but our team just made the calculation once, looking like, okay, so if we include Reverion technology at all the biogas plants existing in the world, I think they came up with 6 gigatons of CO2 removal that we can go with. I think this is quite a way to go, though. But yeah, that would be the number to say here.
Okay, thank you very much for attempting to commit both of you.
Yes, thank you both for that. That's all the audience questions got through. I can see this clock ticking down in front of me. So just, I guess, one final wrap-up question from me. If you had one message, one concluding thought, or one takeaway from this session for today's audience, what would that be? Sarah, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I think it's always an umbrella on different solutions, and we shouldn't close any doors. We need to leave doors open to DEX, to BECCS, to other technologies that may come up, to Reverion itself probably. And I really see that this market needs to develop, and that this market needs kind of more security, so to say, because we don't know how the market will develop from later than 2030 on, like how it will be implemented into regulation on all of those topics. So there's also always some uncertainty that we're facing. And I just hope that we are all still working on that together, and makes me really hoping for like a world where we can also create negative emissions. And then just some personal words, it was really amazing being here with you, Kripa, today, because I think this whole gas world, so to say, sometimes lacks a bit of female power, so to say. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here today, and also really happy to be here with you today.
A great message to end on there, Sarah. And Kripa, how about you?
Thank you. I was going to say something similar, actually. I would love to be in these conferences in the coming years and say that we are having open, healthy debates. We need all the source of CO2 we can get over the coming years for either utilization, merchant CO2, or for removals. And so I would just say to ask, my takeaway message would be to be open to the debate of new technologies, but also to the challenges that the merchant CO2 market have, and continue on that conversation. But things like DAC, things like what Reverion are doing are very much real. They are here. They might not be perfect, or they might not be perfectly cost optimized, but we will get there as long as we're open to having that conversation together. So thank you for facilitating that discussion. And I'm looking forward to similar debates in future as well.
Our pleasure.
Yes, the pleasure really is ours. Thank you once again to our panel. You've been listening to Kripa Balachandran of Mission Zero Technologies and Sarah Grimm of Reverion. Let's give them one final round of applause. What a fantastic session that was, and great to relive that event once again. Perhaps the last time we'll revisit that in these podcast episodes.
I think that does conclude our Rotterdam 2026 coverage, doesn't it? But shout out to two fantastic speakers there who took the questions, took some of the cynicism head on, you have to say, where the DAC conversation is concerned. It was a pleasure to be a part of it, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was fantastic, and some great questions from the audience once again, as we see. Well, that event was a real hotbed for audience questions,
I don't
wasn't it?
think I've ever seen so much Q&A, so many questions coming in across one of our events as that one before. So that shows just how much fervent conversation there is in these topics, and also how critical it is that we start to get all of these things discussed and actioned and evolve this whole sector. It shows, what a hot topic it is.
Absolutely. I think that's enough from us today. Should point listeners in the direction of our recent webinar on biogas to carry on that conversation, a great conversation there that we had with David, Philip, Bjorgulf and Simon. That's on demand right now, so please do go back and watch that. But next week, maybe we should get away from the topic of CO2. We've covered it a lot recently.
Yeah, we've got a pretty big topic coming up next week, I think, haven't we? There's some very big, interesting things being said in hydrogen at the moment, and we've not touched that topic for a few weeks now extensively. We've been around the houses on a lot of those conversations around the hydrogen market, but I think we've got a big, pretty juicy one to get into next week.
I think so. That's a lovely tip, a nice tease for our listeners. So do be sure to join us again next week for the 1895 podcast. But in the meantime, do please like, follow and share.